Frost on the fence wire. Before sunrise, before the rooster, before anything else stirs, a woman walks a gravel path with two dented buckets, steam rising off the feed inside. Cats pour out of the dark like water finding its level. Dozens, then more. They wind around her boots, silent, hungry, sure of her. She doesn't flinch. She hums low an old church tune and pours the feed into rows of chipped bowls lined up like communion plates. Somewhere behind her, a truck slows on the county road. A man leans out, shakes his head, drives on. She keeps pouring. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, though the county just called her Nell. 61 years old, widowed, and by most accounts in Pike County, Missouri, a woman who'd lost her good sense somewhere around her 200th cat. Every morning, rain or frost or blistering July heat, she fed them. Every morning, someone watched her do it and wondered aloud what in the world she was thinking. What nobody knew yet, what nobody could have guessed, standing at that fence line clutching their coffee, was that Nell Whitfield wasn't losing her mind at all. She was building something, and it would save every one of them. Before we get to what happened out on that farm, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this from your own porch, your own kitchen table, your own quiet corner of the world, tell me where you're tuning in from down in the comments. And if stories like Nell's feel like home to you, stay a while. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to that gravel road and the winter that nearly took everything from her. Whitfield Farm sat on 110 acres just outside Bowling Green in Pike County, Missouri, flat land, black soil, the kind of ground men had fought wars in courtrooms over. Nell's husband, Harold, had died 3 winters back, heart giving out in the middle of soybean harvest, and left her the land, the debt, and a barn full of silence. The bank note came due every October like clockwork, rain or shine, grief or none. Corning Ag Credit held it. Mr. Delbert Corning himself, silver-haired, soft-spoken, came out twice a year to walk her fields with a clipboard and a face that gave nothing away. The trouble was the cats. It started with 3 barn strays Harold had never minded, and by the second spring after his death, it was closer to 200. Word got around fast in a small county. At the feed store, at the Baptist church potluck, at the diner counter where the old farmers drank their coffee black, people talked. Some called her the cat lady of Pike County, not kindly. Delbert Corning had seen the feed bill increase alongside a shrinking harvest yield, and on his spring visit, he stood at her fence and said what half the county was already thinking. "Nell," he said, tapping his clipboard against his thigh, "you're 60 days behind on the note and you're spending what little you've got on cat feed." He wasn't cruel about it. He just looked tired, the way bankers look when they've delivered this speech too many times to too many good people. "Everyone's asking why. I'd like to know myself." Nell didn't answer right away. She looked out past him toward the old grain barn, its tin roof catching the gray spring light. "You'll know," she said, "come harvest." Corning didn't smile. He just wrote something down and drove off in a cloud of dust. Her neighbor, a big, easy-laughing farmer named Roy Buell who worked the section next to hers, wasn't shy about his doubts either. He'd lean on her fence some evenings, chewing a toothpick, and say things like, "Nell, you could feed a family of 4 on what you spend on tabby cats." She'd just smile and keep stacking feed sacks in the barn loft, sacks she'd started storing differently that year, tucked high on pallets, away from the walls, covered in a way that made no sense to a man who'd farmed the same way for 40 years. Roy noticed. He mentioned it around town. Folks laughed a little harder after that. What none of them saw, because none of them ever stepped foot past her fence line, was the barn itself. Nell had built small wooden shelters between the grain bins, little cat houses no bigger than dog houses, lined with hay, tucked into every corner of every outbuilding on the property. She'd spend hours out there past dusk, not just feeding, but watching where the cats gathered thickest, watching which corners of which barns drew them like a current pulled toward a drain. She kept a notebook, an old marbled composition book, filled with dates and numbers that made sense to no one but her. By August, the whole county was drought-stricken and desperate. Corn stood stunted in the fields. Grain prices had spiked. which should have been good news except that everyone's yield was down, and Corning Ag Credit had started calling in notes early on 3 separate farms already. Nell's own note was due October the 15th, full payment or the bank would take the north 40 acres, the barn, and likely the house besides. Roy Buell told her plain one evening, not unkindly, "Nell, I like you. But feeding 200 strays while your own roof needs shingles, that ain't wisdom, that's grief talking. You ought to let some of them go." She didn't argue. She just handed him a cup of coffee and looked toward the grain silos, where, if you watched closely in the fatting light, you could see shapes moving low along the base of the walls, quick, silent, purposeful. Roy didn't look twice. Most people never did. Nell had learned something in her 61 years that the county hadn't caught up to yet, that the smallest, most ridiculed creatures on a farm were sometimes doing the heaviest lifting quietly in the dark, while everyone slept. The clock on the bank note kept ticking, the drought kept tightening, and Nell kept feeding her cats. Then came the news that shook the whole county. A wet spring the year before, followed by a mild winter, had done what old-timers feared most, a rodent boom. Mice and voles had multiplied unchecked across Pike County's farms, burrowing into grain stores all summer, breeding in the walls of barns nobody thought to check. By September, 3 of the county's biggest grain operations discovered their stored corn and soybeans riddled through, droppings, gnaw marks, mold blooming where rodents had chewed into the sacking and let moisture in. Buell's own grain bins turned up infested. 2 other farms lost nearly a third of their stored harvest overnight. Panic spread through Bowling Green like brush fire. Delbert Corning drove out to 3 ruined properties that week, clipboard in hand, watching farmers weep over grain bins crawling with vermin, entire seasons of labor gone soft and gray with mold and waste. He'd seen bad years before, but nothing like this, a plague moving farm to farm, silent and merciless. While the whole county had been busy laughing at an old widow and her cats. On the 4th day, driving the county road out of habit more than hope, he passed the Whitfield place. And something made him slow the truck down. Something made him turn in at her gate. He walked into her grain barn expecting the same devastation he'd seen all week. Instead, he found it whole, untouched. The sacking clean, the corn dry and gold and heavy in the bins. Not a single dropping, not one gnaw mark in 100 yards of stacked feed. And everywhere he looked perched on beams, curled in the little wooden houses tucked between the silos, stretched along the walls like a living fence, cats. 200 of them, lean and quiet and watchful, doing exactly what barn cats had done for 10,000 years before anyone thought to laugh at the woman who fed them. Corning stood in the doorway a long moment, hat in his hand, saying nothing. Behind him, Roy Buell had followed, drawn by the same disbelief, and he stood staring at Nell's clean, dry, unspoiled harvest while his own bin sat half-ruined a quarter-mile down the road. Nell came in from the yard, wiping her hands on her apron, unsurprised to see them. "Told you," she said quietly, "you'd no come harvest." Corning looked at his clipboard, then at the barn, then folded the clipboard shut without writing a word. "Nell," he said, voice rough, "I believe I owe you an apology." Word spread through Pike County faster than the rodent plague itself had. Within a week, 3 neighboring farms, Roy Buell's among them, were out at Nell's gate asking, hat in hand, whether she'd spare a few cats for their own barns come next season. Corning Ag Credit quietly extended her note, then forgave the late fees altogether, calling it, in his own dry words, a sound agricultural investment. The cat lady of Pike County became, within a single harvest season, the woman half the county now called for advice. Nell just kept doing what she'd always done, filling the same dented buckets, walking the same gravel path, before the sun was even up. What Nell knew, and what the whole county learned that October, was simple enough to fit on a church sign. The things we're quickest to mock are often the things quietly holding everything together. She never set out to prove anybody wrong. She just kept faith with creatures nobody else valued, through years when faith was the only currency she had left. And in the end, it wasn't luck or stubbornness that saved her harvest and half the county besides. It was 200 small, unglamorous lives, fed faithfully in the dark, standing guard while everyone else was busy looking the other way.